The statue came down on a Tuesday evening. It had stood for 6 years at the southern tip of Manhattan, at a place called Bowling Green. A gilded king on a gilded horse, twice the size of a living man, George III, King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the territories beyond the seas. The lead beneath the gold caught the torchlight at night, and for 6 years the people of New York had walked past it, the way people walk past things that have always been there and seem like they always will be. Then someone read them a letter. On the afternoon of July 9th, 1776, General Washington ordered the Declaration of Independence read aloud to his troops stationed in New York. The words move through the summer heat. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Then the long list of accusations, each one aimed at the same man. By evening, the ropes were out. The crowd at Bowling Green was not an army. Merchants and laborers and soldiers and people who had simply heard what was happening and walked toward it. They threw ropes around the neck of the horse. They pulled. The statue rocked once, then came down hard. Gilded lead hitting cobblestone. What happened next is the part nobody tells in school. They did not leave it there. They cut the statue into pieces, loaded it onto carts, hauled it to Connecticut, and melted it down. Women and children helped pour the metal into molds. 42,000 musket balls, by the count that survives. The king who had ruled them was now ammunition. Here is the question nobody in that crowd stopped to ask. The man who designed the Stamp Act was George Grenville. The man who built the Townshend duties was Charles Townshend. Every piece of legislation the colonists despised had been voted through Parliament, in a building filled with men whose names most Americans today cannot recall. No crowd pulled down a statue of Charles Townshend. Nobody melted George Grenville into bullets. Only the king. Why? That question is what this story is about. Before America could become itself, it needed someone to reject. It needed a face for everything it had decided not to be, and the face it chose was his. The answer begins not in Boston, not in Philadelphia, not at Lexington or Concord. It begins in London, in the spring of 1751, when a 12-year-old boy got news that changed everything, and a crown he was never supposed to wear started moving toward his head. Frederick, Prince of Wales, died in March of 1751, and almost nobody mourned him. That sounds harsh. It is also true. Frederick had spent most of his adult life in open warfare with his own father, King George II, a conflict so public and so petty it had become a kind of national entertainment. The king once said, in front of witnesses, that Frederick was the greatest villain ever born. Frederick responded by having pamphlets printed. They genuinely despised each other, and the court had long since divided into two camps, and everyone knew which side they were on. Frederick was 44 when he died. The cause remains genuinely unclear even now. Stories about a chest injury, an abscess in the lung, an old wound that never healed. What is certain is that his death came fast, without warning, the way deaths in the 18th century often did. What came next was a 12-year-old boy named George William Frederick. He was Frederick's eldest son. Before his father's death, his role was straightforward. He would be educated, prepared, and eventually, when the old king died and Frederick took the throne, he would become the next in line and wait his turn. There was no rush, no pressure. He had time. Then Frederick died. And the 12-year-old, who had been kept in the background, was suddenly the heir to the British throne. The people who wrote about George as a child were not kind. His tutors found him slow. In a court where intelligence was performed loudly and constantly, where wit was currency and education was blood sport. He was the child who sat in the corner and said little. He learned to read later than expected. He struggled with the rapid, brilliant comprehension that royal households took for granted. One report described him as having a remarkable lack of curiosity. He was also, by every account, deeply good-natured. He was not cruel. He was not vain. He did not have the sharp edges that court life usually carved into children raised inside it. He was quiet and serious and, in the word that appears again and again from people who knew him young, dutiful. That word would follow him for the rest of his life. It would be his greatest strength, and, in the right circumstances, something close to a weapon turned against himself. After Frederick's death, the dominant figure in young George's life became his mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. She was protective of her children with an intensity that made people uncomfortable, suspicious of the court around her, suspicious of the factions and intrigues that had consumed her husband, determined that her son would not be eaten alive by the same machinery. She had a sentence, she said to George. It appears in multiple accounts from people who were present. She said it often enough that it became something close to a daily instruction. George, be a king. Not be a wise king. Not be a just king. Not be a good king. Simply be a king. Assert yourself. Do not let the ministers run you. Do not bend. It sounds like advice given in love. Because it was, Augusta believed she was protecting her son. She was also, without knowing it, building a wall inside him, a wall between himself and the possibility that flexibility, that compromise, that the willingness to yield on principle in service of something larger, could ever be anything other than weakness. The other significant figure in his education was a Scottish nobleman named John Stuart, the Earl of Bute. Bute became something close to a father figure after Frederick died. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely fond of his student. He taught George history, philosophy, the theory of constitutional government. He taught him that a king's highest calling was virtue, that political corruption was a disease to be resisted, that a good man on the throne could restore the dignity the crown had lost. Bute was not wrong about any of this in the abstract. In the specific, in the practical, his lessons left enormous gaps. He taught George what a king should be. He did not adequately teach him how to be one, in a world where being one meant constant negotiation with Parliament, with ministers, with the competing interests of an empire that stretched across half the globe. George II died in October of 1760. He was 76. He had ruled for 33 years. George William Frederick was 22 years old. He became George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, sovereign of territories stretching from the Caribbean to the coast of India to the eastern edge of North America. He received the news with the composure his mother had trained into him. He gave the appropriate instructions. He said the appropriate things. Then, alone, he sat with what had just happened, 22 years old, raised by a mother who told him to be a king, educated by a tutor who told him what a king should be, standing now at the center of the largest empire in the world, knowing almost nothing about the people on the other side of the Atlantic, who were, at that moment, his subjects. going about their lives with no awareness that anything had changed. They would learn his name. He would never really learn theirs. That distance, an ocean wide and deeper than geography, was where the next 60 years of history would be decided. On the morning of his coronation, September 22nd, 1760, George III rode through London in a gilded coach, and the crowds came out to see him. This was not unusual. Crowds always came out for coronations. What was unusual was the feeling underneath the cheering, something the newspapers tried to capture in the days that followed, and never quite managed. It was not simply excitement about a new king. It was relief, a specific, exhaled, long-held relief, the kind that comes when something you have been quietly worried about for years finally resolves in the direction you hoped. The two kings before George III had been German, not German by blood only, German in language, in temperament, in the way they held themselves. Apart from the country they ruled, George I had arrived in England in 1714, unable to speak English and never bothered to learn it properly. He conducted his government in French and Latin and left the running of things to ministers who understood the language of the people they governed. George II was better, but not by much. He had grown up in Hanover, thought in German, dreamed in German, and returned to Hanover whenever he could, as if England were a job he had to report to rather than a home he had chosen. The people had accepted this, but they had not loved it. There was always a slight chill between the first two Georges and the country they ruled, a distance that no amount of ceremony could fully close. George III opened his mouth at his first address to Parliament, and the relief in the room was almost audible. Born and educated in this country, he said, "I glory in the name of Britain." He meant every word. This was not performance. George III had grown up in England, spoken English as his first language, read English history, absorbed English culture in the way that children absorb the world around them, completely and without thinking about it. He did not feel German. He felt British, and he wanted to be a British king, not a German who happened to sit on the British throne. The people received this like water after a long dry season. In the months after his coronation, those who spent time with him found someone who did not match any category they had prepared for. He was not the brilliant, commanding presence the role seemed to demand. He was not the distant, ceremonial figure his predecessors had been. He was something harder to place, conscientious, methodical, almost painfully earnest about doing things correctly. He woke at 5 in the morning. He worked through his correspondence before most of his court was awake. He read everything that came across his desk, not skimming the way busy men skim, but reading carefully, annotating, asking questions. His appetite for information about his kingdom was something his ministers found, depending on their temperament, either reassuring or exhausting. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He had no mistresses, which in the context of the 18th century British court was so unusual as to seem almost eccentric. His court physician would later note that in 40 years of service he had never attended the king for anything related to excess. George III lived like a country clergyman who happened to own half the world. He also fell in love, which no one had particularly expected. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz arrived in England in September of 1761, 2 weeks before their wedding. She was 17 years old, had been selected from a short list of suitable Protestant princesses, and had never met the man she was about to marry. This was entirely normal for royal marriages of the period. What happened next was not normal at all. George met her on the day she arrived, a few hours before the ceremony. By every account, from people who were present, something shifted in him almost immediately. He was attentive in a way that went beyond courtesy, genuinely curious about who she was. Charlotte spoke no English when she arrived. In the evenings of their early marriage, George sat with her and taught her, one word at a time, in the lamplight of their private rooms. The King of England, teaching his new queen to speak to his people, patiently, without ceremony, like any husband who wants his wife to feel at home. They would have 15 children together. In 57 years of marriage, there was never a documented affair, never a period of the cold estrangement that characterized most royal unions of the era. People who saw them together in private, not in ceremony, but in the ordinary moments of a shared life, remarked on something they often struggled to name. The king and queen seemed to actually like each other. This is worth saying plainly, because it is so easy to lose in the larger story. The man who would become the villain of the American founding was, in his private life, a devoted husband, an engaged father, a person of genuine warmth toward the people he allowed close to him. The distance between that man and the caricature of the mad tyrant is not a small distance. It is almost the entire distance. But private virtue and public wisdom are different things. George III came to the throne with a genuine desire to be a different kind of king. He believed in the British Constitution. He believed in Parliament. He believed in the rule of law. What he also believed, with a firmness absorbed from his mother and from Bute, was that the crown had to be strong, that a king who yielded to the demands of whichever faction was shouting loudest was not being flexible. He was being weak, and weakness in a king was not a personal failing. It was a constitutional catastrophe. That belief was not unreasonable. The British system worked. When it worked, because there was a balance between Crown and Parliament, and balance required both sides to hold their ground. A king who collapsed at the first sign of pressure would become an instrument of whoever was most aggressive. The problem was the edge cases, the situations where holding the line was not balance but rigidity, where the principle being defended was real, but the application of it was producing consequences. The principle itself could not justify. George III spent his entire reign unable to find that edge. He held the line when he should have held it, and he held it when he should not have. And he himself could rarely tell the difference. Across the Atlantic, in the 13 colonies, none of this mattered yet. The question of what kind of king George III intended to be was, in 1760, a matter of complete indifference to the merchant in Boston, the planter in Virginia, the farmer in Pennsylvania. The king was a distant figure, his face on the coins, his name spoken in church, real in the way that weather is real, a condition of existence rather than a presence. That was about to change. In the winter of 1763, a man named George Grenville sat down with the books of the British Empire and discovered a problem that no military victory, however complete, could solve. The 7 Years' War had ended. Britain had won. Won is almost too small a word. The Treaty of Paris gave Britain Canada from France, Florida from Spain, dominance over Caribbean trade routes, effective control of India, and unchallenged supremacy over the eastern coast of North America. The empire that emerged from that war was the most powerful the world had seen since Rome. Maps of British territory required a different scale than maps of anyone else's. But Grenville was not looking at maps. He was looking at numbers. The national debt of Britain had doubled during the war. Interest payments alone were consuming more than half of annual government revenue. The cost of maintaining a military presence across all the new territory, the garrisons in Canada, the troops along the western frontier of North America, the naval stations in the Caribbean, was staggering and showed no signs of decreasing. Britain had won an empire it was not sure it could afford to keep. Grenville was the Prime Minister. He was also, by temperament and conviction, an accountant. He believed in balance sheets the way other men believed in scripture. He looked at what the war had cost, looked at who had benefited, and arrived at a conclusion that seemed to him so obviously correct that he was genuinely puzzled when other people could not see it. The American colonists had benefited enormously from the 7 Years' War. French power in North America had been eliminated. The threat from French allied native nations along the frontier had been significantly reduced. The colonists could now expand, trade, and prosper in ways that had been impossible before, all under the protection of British military power. Surely, Grenville reasoned, they could contribute something to the cost of that protection. He was not proposing to impoverish them. The Stamp Act of 1765 levied a tax on paper, on legal documents, on newspapers, on playing cards. The amounts were modest. A newspaper that cost 2 pennies would now cost 2 pennies and a halfpenny. The total revenue Grenville hoped to raise was roughly £100,000 per year. The cost of maintaining British troops in North America was roughly £350,000 per year. He was not even asking the colonists to cover the full cost of their own defence. He was asking for roughly a third of it. The logic was impeccable. The logic missed the point entirely. There was a printer in Boston, a man who ran a small newspaper near the harbour, who was not a wealthy man, not a political man in any formal sense. He printed news. He sold papers. He paid his suppliers and his apprentices and his rent and tried, in the ordinary way of working people, to keep the numbers from going the wrong direction. When the Stamp Act arrived, he looked at what it required. He would need to purchase stamps from the royal distributor and affix them to every piece of paper that left his shop. The stamps cost money. The process took time. The record-keeping required hours that were already fully occupied. None of that was what made him put the stamp down and refuse to use it. What made him refuse was simpler and deeper than cost. It was the fact of the stamp itself, the physical object, a piece of paper issued by an authority in London that had to be affixed to the paper he printed before his neighbours could read what he had written. That authority had not gone through the Massachusetts Assembly, the body that he and every other man in Boston understood to be the place where decisions about taxing Massachusetts people were made. It had simply decided, from 3,000 miles away, that it had the right to require this thing of him. That was the problem. The claim. Patrick Henry made the same point with considerably more drama. Standing in the Virginia House of Burgesses in May of 1765, he said words that a witness described as bordering on treason, asserting that only Virginia had the right to tax Virginians. The room went quiet. Then it erupted. Some members shouted that he had gone too far. Others were on their feet in agreement. Henry's words spread, not instantly, but with the particular speed of ideas that name something people have already been feeling. Within months, representatives from 9 colonies had gathered in New York at the Stamp Act Congress and produced a declaration asserting that Parliament had no right to tax people who had no representatives in Parliament. Taxation without representation. 4 words that had existed in English political thought for a century, but had never before been aimed at this specific situation, with this specific force. In London, George III watched all of this and arrived at a conclusion that was consistent with everything his mother and his tutor had built into him. This was a constitutional crisis, not a financial one. The colonists were not objecting to the amount. They were objecting to the principle, and the principle was not negotiable. Parliament's authority over the whole empire was either complete or it was nothing. You could not have an empire in which some parts accepted parliamentary authority and other parts did not. If the Americans could opt out of one act of Parliament because they found it inconvenient, what was to stop Ireland from doing the same? What was to stop any part of the empire from deciding that this particular law did not apply to them? He was not wrong about the logic. The logic was sound. What the logic could not account for was the distance between a principle stated in a chamber in London and the life of a printer in Boston who looked at a stamp and felt something that ran much deeper than political theory. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. The celebrating in the colonies was immediate and genuine. People poured into the streets. There were bonfires. There were toasts to the king. What almost no one in the celebrating crowds noticed was that Parliament had passed something else. On the same day, it repealed the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, which stated, in plain language, that Parliament had the authority to make laws binding on the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. They had given the colonists what they wanted, and in the same breath, they had asserted the right to take it back whenever they chose. The celebrations continued. The Declaratory Act was noted in a few newspapers, debated in a few assemblies, and largely set aside. People do not read the fine print when they are celebrating, but the fine print was there, and in Whitehall, in the offices where ministers made policy, there were men who believed the principle would need to be enforced again, and soon, because the alternative was to watch the empire quietly rearrange itself around the uncomfortable truth that Parliament's authority stopped at the water's edge. The next move was already being planned. Stop here for a moment, before we follow the road to Lexington, before the guns and the burning towns and the years of war. We need to understand a document, because everything that happened between 1765 and 1775, every tax dispute and town meeting and midnight ride, was moving toward a single piece of paper that would, in the summer of 1776, do something that no battle could do on its own. It would give the Revolution a face on the 4th of July, 1776. Thomas Jefferson presented the Continental Congress with a document he had spent 17 days writing in a rented room in Philadelphia. The first part is the part that gets carved into stone and painted on walls. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Words that reach across centuries and still land with weight. But there is a second part, a longer part, a part that most Americans have heard of, but very few have read all the way through. It is a list of accusations, and again, the grievances return to the same word. He has refused his assent to laws. He has dissolved representative houses. He has kept among us standing armies. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns. The same word, the same target. One man placed at the center of every grievance. Until by the end of the list, there is no question in the reader's mind who is responsible for everything that has gone wrong. Not Parliament, not the ministry, not the complicated machinery of an empire making bad decisions through 100 different hands. Just him. He, George III, King of Great Britain, the villain of the piece. Standing alone at the center of the accusation, here is the thing about that choice that changes how you read everything that came before it. Thomas Jefferson was one of the finest legal minds in the colonies. He knew that Parliament had passed the Stamp Act, not the King. He knew that Charles Townshend had designed the Townshend duties, not the King. He knew that the intolerable acts had been voted through a legislative body in which George III held exactly one voice among many. Jefferson had read the law. He understood the Constitution. He knew precisely where the power in the British system actually sat. He wrote anyway. The Declaration of Independence was not a legal brief. It was not a historical analysis. It was a revolutionary argument, written to accomplish specific things that legal briefs cannot accomplish on their own. It needed to convince the 1/3 of colonists, still undecided, that independence was not just desirable, but necessary and just. It needed to persuade France, Spain, and the other European powers that America was not a mob of ungrateful subjects, but a nation asserting rights that any civilized government would recognize. It needed to create, out of 13 separate colonies with 13 separate histories, something that felt like a single people with a single enemy. You cannot do that with a system. You cannot do that with a legislature. You cannot ask a crowd to hate a committee. But a king has a face. A king has a name. A king can be held responsible in the way that human beings have always needed to hold someone responsible, in the way that makes the anger clean and the cause clear, and the choice between sides as simple as a story needs to be when it is asking people to risk their lives. Jefferson understood this with the instinct of a genius. The Declaration was morally serious, politically brilliant, and historically selective. And all three of those things are true at the same time, without any one of them cancelling the others out. Now look at 3 of the specific accusations, because they reveal something important. He has kept among us standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. True in the strict sense. British troops had been stationed in the colonies since the 7 Years' War. But the original justification for those troops was protection of the western frontier, a purpose that benefited the colonists as much as anyone. The standing army became a symbol of oppression. And in Boston, it absolutely was that, but the accusation presents it as pure aggression from the beginning, which is not the whole story. He has refused his assent to laws. George III had the power to refuse colonial legislation. He rarely used it. Most of what the colonists experienced as royal obstruction came from Parliament and from the ministry, not from the king acting alone. He has excited domestic insurrections among us. This refers to Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775, in which the royal governor of Virginia offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped their patriot masters and joined the British forces. And here is where the accusation tears open the deepest contradiction in the entire founding. The men writing the Declaration, several of whom owned enslaved people, were calling it a crime that the British Crown had offered those people freedom. They listed it, without apparent irony, among the acts of a tyrant. This is the contradiction that the Declaration put into writing and then moved past without dwelling on. Jefferson's original draft had included a lengthy passage condemning the slave trade and blaming the king for it. The Congress removed that passage entirely, because South Carolina and Georgia would not sign a document that threatened the institution of slavery. What remained was the accusation against Dunmore, against the idea of enslaved people choosing freedom, named as an act of tyranny. If you want to understand why the story of the American Revolution is more complicated than any single telling of it, start there. But here is what the Declaration accomplished that transcended all of its complications and contradictions. It worked. France came in. The undecided colonists made up their minds. The 13 colonies began, fitfully and imperfectly, to act like one country. And George III, the man who had spent 15 years trying to hold an empire together because he genuinely believed that was his duty, became the face of everything that a new nation had decided to reject. He did not know it yet. In London, in the summer of 1776, the Declaration was received as rebel propaganda, the kind of document that losing causes produce before they collapse. His ministers told him the rebellion would be finished within a year. His generals said the same. He believed them. He should not have believed them. But to understand why he did, you have to go back a few years, to the city that turned resistance into an art form, and to the chain of decisions that made everything that came after impossible to stop. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John in the autumn of 1773 and described an evening at their home in Braintree, Massachusetts, the way she described most things, with precision and without self-pity. She wrote that she had served their guests hot water, not tea. Hot water. The distinction mattered, and she knew John would understand why without her having to explain it, though she explained it anyway. Because Abigail Adams was not a woman who left important things unexplained. She had decided she would not purchase tea from the East India Company, that she would not participate in a system that treated her and her neighbours as people whose consent to their own taxation was irrelevant, and that if this meant serving hot water in the evening, then hot water it would be. She was 30 years old. She ran a household, raised children, managed a farm while her husband was away, and she had decided, without drama and without anyone telling her to, that a pot of tea was a political statement, and she was not going to make that particular statement. This is where the revolution actually lived, not only in the assembly halls and the coffee houses and the pamphlets, though it lived there too. It lived in kitchens and shops and harbours and print rooms, in the 10,000 daily decisions that ordinary people made about how to exist inside a system they had begun to find intolerable. After the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, Parliament tried again almost immediately. Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, proposed a new set of taxes in 1767, this time on imports, on glass and paper and paint and tea coming into the colonies from Britain. The theory was that external taxes on trade were constitutionally different from the internal taxes the colonists had rejected with the Stamp Act. The colonists disagreed. John Dickinson, a Philadelphia lawyer, wrote a series of letters under the name A Farmer in Pennsylvania that made the argument clearly enough for almost anyone to follow. The issue was not the form of the tax. The issue was who had the right to impose it. Parliament had that right over British subjects in Britain. Parliament did not have that right over British subjects in America, because those subjects had no voice in Parliament, no representative who could argue for them or against the tax. The form was irrelevant. The fact of the imposition was everything. The letters circulated through the colonies and were reprinted in newspapers from Massachusetts to Georgia. They also clarified the argument in a way that made compromise significantly harder, because once you stated the principle that clearly there was no middle position, either Parliament had the right or it did not. The Townshend duties met with another round of boycotts. Merchants stopped importing British goods. Women organized non-importation agreements and enforced them with social pressure more effective than any legal sanction. A merchant who broke the boycott found his name in the newspaper the next morning. In Boston, British troops sent to enforce order were making things worse in the way that armed enforcers always make things worse when the population has already decided the authority behind them is illegitimate. The soldiers needed to be housed, and the Quartering Act required the colonists to help house them, which meant the physical embodiment of parliamentary overreach was living in your neighbour's spare room. On the evening of March 5th, 1772, it came apart. A crowd gathered near the Customs House on King Street. There were British soldiers. There was shouting, and thrown ice and rocks, and someone fired a shot, and then more shots. And when it was over, 5 men were dead on the cobblestones. Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent who had been in the crowd, was among the first to fall. The soldiers were tried for murder. John Adams defended them in court, because Adams believed that even soldiers he despised deserved a fair trial. 6 were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. None of that is what people remembered. What people remembered was Paul Revere's engraving, published within weeks of the shooting. It showed British soldiers in a neat line, taking aim with military precision at a crowd of unarmed civilians. The image bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened on King Street, which was chaotic and dark and complicated in the way that real violence is always complicated. But Revere's engraving was not complicated. It was clear, and it was damning, and it was reproduced in newspapers across the colonies for months. The Boston Massacre was one of the first events in American history where the image of the event mattered more than the event itself. Paul Revere understood something that propagandists and journalists have understood ever since. A story needs a picture. The picture becomes the story. 3 years later, the tea arrived. The Tea Act of 1773 was, in purely economic terms, a gift to the colonies. It actually reduced the price of tea by eliminating certain duties and allowing the East India Company to sell directly to American consumers, cutting out the middlemen. Tea in Boston would be cheaper under the Tea Act than it had been before. The colonists were furious. This seems contradictory until you understand what they were furious about. The Tea Act was not about price. It was about the Townshend duty on tea that remained in place, a small tax that Parliament had kept specifically to maintain the principle that it had the right to tax the colonies. The cheap tea was a trap. Accept it, pay the tax. And you had conceded the principle. You had admitted that Parliament's right to tax you was real. On the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of men dressed in rough approximation of Mohawk clothing boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. They worked efficiently and in relative silence. When they were done, they swept the decks and dispersed. It was a highly organized act of property destruction by men who had planned it carefully and who took pains to damage nothing except the tea itself. Whatever you think of what they did it with discipline. The reaction in London was fury, not political calculation, actual fury. The coercive acts, which the colonists immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts, closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, revoked the Massachusetts Charter of Self-Governance, put the colony under military administration, and expanded the Quartering Act. George III approved every word of it. His reasoning followed the logic he had applied from the beginning. The destruction of the tea was not protest. It was lawlessness. If the Crown did not respond firmly, it was not teaching a lesson about limits. It was teaching that defiance worked. He was not wrong that defiance could not go unanswered. He was catastrophically wrong about what answering it this way would produce. The intolerable acts were designed to punish Massachusetts and isolate it. Instead, they unified the colonies in a way that 15 years of pamphlets had not quite managed. South Carolina sent rice. Pennsylvania sent money. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting in solidarity with Boston. Delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in September of 1774 for the First Continental Congress. George III had wanted to teach the colonies that Boston's defiance would cost Boston. What he taught them instead was that what happened to Boston could happen to any of them. Back in Braintree, Abigail Adams kept serving hot water, and somewhere in the distance, still faint but getting louder, a clock was running down toward a morning in April when a group of farmers would stand on a village, green at dawn, and the sound of a single shot would change everything that came before it. Here is a question that most American history classes do not ask. Of the roughly 3 million people living in the 13 colonies in 1776, how many actually wanted independence? The honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty. The old shorthand says 1/3 patriot, 1/3 loyalist, 1/3 neutral. The reality was messier. Active loyalists were probably fewer than that. But the number of Americans who were uncertain, cautious, frightened, or divided was enormous. What is clear is that the revolution was not a unified uprising of a people against a tyrant. It was a civil war inside a society, a rupture that divided neighbors and families along lines that did not always follow the boundaries of class or region or religion. The people on the losing side of that rupture are largely absent from the version of events that survived into the history books. Their stories are what this chapter is about. Thomas Peters was born in a region of West Africa that is now Nigeria, in a community of the Egba people. Sometime around 1738, he was captured in a raid, sold to slave traders, transported across the Atlantic in the hold of a ship, and sold again in the colony of North Carolina, where he became the property of a planter named William Campbell. He worked Campbell's land for years. He learned English. He married a woman named Sally, who was also enslaved. He had children. He survived in the way that enslaved people survived in the colonial South, by learning precisely how much resistance was possible and staying just inside that line, while carrying, as every enslaved person carried, the knowledge of what had been taken from him in November of 1775. The royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation. It offered freedom to any enslaved person or indentured servant belonging to a patriot rebel who escaped and joined the British forces. Thomas Peters walked away from William Campbell's plantation within weeks. He was not walking toward George III. He did not have particular feelings about the British Constitution or the rights of Parliament. He was walking toward the only force in the world that was, at that specific moment, offering him what the men writing pamphlets about liberty in Philadelphia were not offering him: freedom. This is the contradiction that the Declaration of Independence put into writing and then moved past without dwelling on. The men who wrote all men are created equal, several of whom owned enslaved people, were accusing the British Crown of inciting enslaved people to seek their freedom and calling it a crime. And the king they called a tyrant was, through his governor's proclamation, doing something closer to the stated ideals of the revolution than the revolution itself was doing. Peters fought with the British forces. He served with distinction. He survived the war, and when it ended, when the Treaty of Paris gave the Americans their independence and left the question of what happened to the black loyalists entirely unresolved, Peters found himself in Nova Scotia with thousands of others who had made the same choice, living on the poorest land, receiving the smallest allocations, the last people anyone in the new arrangements thought about. He eventually went to London to present a petition to the British government on behalf of the black loyalists in Nova Scotia. He argued their case in offices where no one had expected to see him. In 1792, he led more than 1,000 people onto ships bound for Sierra Leone. Returning to the continent his ancestors had been taken from, not in chains, but as a free man, leading other free people, he died in Sierra Leone 4 months after arriving, worn out by decades of fighting for a basic dignity that the revolution had not seen fit to extend to him. His name does not appear in most accounts of the American Revolution. Joseph Brant was a young man of the Mohawk Nation who had received an English education, spoke English fluently, and moved with confidence in both the world of the Iroquois Confederacy and the world of the British colonists he had grown up alongside. His Mohawk name was Thyandanagia. He would spend the Revolutionary War as a military leader and diplomat fighting on the British side, and his reasons had nothing to do with love of the crown as an abstraction. Brant understood something that neither the Patriots nor the British fully grasped about the situation of the Iroquois nations. The enemy of the Mohawk was not George III. The enemy of the Mohawk was westward expansion. For 100 years, the colonies had been pushing into territory that belonged to native peoples. The British Crown, whatever its other failings, had issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains and declaring that the land to the west was Indian territory. The Patriots hated that proclamation. Many of the wealthy Virginia planters who became founding fathers had land speculation interests west of that line. When they listed among the king's tyrannies his failure to allow further western settlement, they were speaking a language that Brant understood perfectly. If the Patriots won, that line was gone. The Mohawk and the other nations of the Iroquois Confederacy would face settlers backed by a government that had just fought a revolution in the name of liberty and had a great deal of land it needed to distribute to the people who had fought for it. Brant chose Britain. He fought effectively, and he fought hard. When Britain lost, the Treaty of Paris made no mention of the native nations that had fought on the British side, their land, their sovereignty, their survival as distinct peoples. None of it appeared anywhere in the negotiations. The Mohawk were abandoned by the power they had chosen because that power had decided, in the balance of interests between empires, that the people who had bled for them could be left out of the final accounting. Grace Galloway had a diary. She was the wife of Joseph Galloway, a Philadelphia lawyer who had been one of the most thoughtful and influential men in the colonies before the Revolution. In 1774, at the First Continental Congress, Joseph had proposed a plan of union that would have created an American Parliament working alongside Westminster, giving the colonies representation and self-governance while keeping them within the British Empire. The plan was defeated by one vote. One vote. Joseph Galloway watched the war begin and concluded that the Patriot cause would fail. He chose the British side and left for New York when the British occupied it. Grace stayed in Philadelphia. She stayed because she believed the family's property would be protected. She stayed because she had a daughter to look after. She stayed because leaving meant admitting the life she had built was over. The Pennsylvania government confiscated the Galloway properties. Grace was allowed to remain in her house as a tenant, not an owner, in rooms that had been hers for her entire adult life. She watched the furniture she had chosen, the paintings she had hung, the household she had assembled over decades, inventoried and assessed by men with clipboards who were polite in the way that people are polite when they have all the power and you have none. She wrote about it every day. I have nobody to speak to. She wrote in the spring of 1779. Nobody to advise with. Nobody who cares whether I live or die. Joseph Galloway died in England in 1803. In exile. Grace died in Philadelphia in 1782. Before the war was even officially over, Hannah Griffiths was a Quaker poet in Philadelphia who wanted nothing to do with any of it. She was not a loyalist. She did not believe that George III was right or that Parliament had authority over the colonies. She also did not believe that war was a legitimate answer to political disagreement. She wrote poems about the hypocrisy of men who talked about liberty while keeping people in chains. She wrote about the violence being done in the name of principles that the violence itself was undermining. She wrote about the impossibility of standing in the middle when the middle was being erased. The Quakers were suspected by both sides. The Patriots thought they were British sympathizers. The British thought they were potential rebels. They were neither. They were people who had built their lives around the conviction that violence was wrong, and who found that conviction left you without a country when a revolutionary war came through. Here is what these 4 stories share. They are all stories of people who were present at the founding of the United States and who were left out of the founding of the United States, not through deliberate malice, but through the logic of how nations build their histories, which requires a clear story and a clear set of heroes, and cannot easily accommodate the people whose presence complicates all 3 of those things. George III, in the Declaration of Independence, was held responsible for their suffering too. For the enslaved people he failed to free, and for the enslaved people he offered freedom to. For the native nations he failed to protect, and for the native nations he abandoned in the treaty. For the loyalists he could not keep safe, and for the neutrals he could not reassure. Some of that responsibility was real. Much of it was the responsibility of a system too large and too entangled in its own contradictions to be fairly placed on any single man. But systems do not go on trial. People do. And in the summer of 1776, one person went on trial for all of it. This is the chapter where we try to do something genuinely difficult. We are going to try to understand George III, not excuse him, not argue that the revolution was wrong or that the declaration was unfair. But the fact remains that George III was not a villain in his own mind. He was a man who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was doing the right thing. And if we cannot understand how a person can believe that while doing things that cause tremendous harm, we do not understand very much about how history actually works. Start with what George III saw when he looked at the situation in the colonies. He saw subjects of the British Crown who had been granted extensive liberties, protected by the British military, who had prospered under British trade arrangements, and who were now refusing to acknowledge that their relationship with the Crown carried any obligations at all. They wanted the benefits of empire without the responsibilities of it. They wanted protection without cost. They wanted the freedom to govern themselves entirely while still claiming the privileges of British subjects. From London, that looked like wanting to have it both ways. George III was also looking at a constitutional principle that was, in the context of British law and history, genuinely sound. Parliament's authority over the empire was not some novel tyrannical invention. It was the bedrock of the constitutional settlement that had emerged from the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the settlement that had replaced absolute monarchy with parliamentary sovereignty, and that was widely regarded as one of the great achievements of English political history. If you granted that the colonists were right, that Parliament had no authority to tax them without their specific consent, then you had done something that went far beyond settling a colonial dispute. You had created a precedent that could be used by Ireland, by the Caribbean colonies, by India, by anyone who wanted to opt out of parliamentary authority. The empire would become a collection of autonomous units that happened to share a king, each deciding for itself which laws it would obey. George III looked at that prospect and saw catastrophe. Not for himself exactly, though the weakening of the crown was certainly part of his concern, but for Britain, for the stability and prosperity of an empire that was, whatever its faults, the most successful political structure in the world at that moment. He was protecting something real. He believed that completely. Edmund Burke stood up in the House of Commons in March of 1775 and tried to explain to Parliament why all of this principled firmness was going to produce a disaster. Burke was not an American sympathizer in any simple sense. He was a British conservative who believed in the British Empire and wanted to preserve it. What he understood, in a way that George III and Lord North and most of the ministry did not, was that an empire held together by force was not an empire. It was an occupation, and occupations end in one of two ways. Either the occupying power leaves, or the occupied people make the cost of staying higher than the power is willing to pay. The question is not whether you have a right to render your people miserable, Burke told Parliament, but whether it is not your interest to make them happy. Parliament did not change course. George III read Burke's speech and found it eloquent and beside the point, as the king understood it, was not happiness. It was authority, and authority could not be compromised without being destroyed. He was right about the principle. He was wrong about what defending the principle this way would cost. In the evenings, in his private correspondence, George III wrote about the colonial situation with a directness his public statements did not always show. He wrote about duty, about the impossibility of yielding, about his fear that weakness on this question would be the beginning of the end, not just for his reign but for the empire itself. He wrote about the colonists without hatred. That is worth noting. He described them not as enemies but as misguided, as people who had been led astray by agitators, who would, once the agitators were removed and order restored, return to their proper loyalty. He genuinely believed this. He believed it past the point where the evidence supported it. He believed it past the point where believing it made any rational sense. There is a particular kind of mistake that intelligent, principled people make when they are in authority. It is the mistake of believing that the people they govern share their fundamental values and their fundamental vision of how things ought to be, and that visible disagreement is therefore the product of manipulation rather than genuine difference. George III made this mistake consistently and completely. He could not accept that the colonists might actually mean what they said, that their objections were not tactical complaints to be managed, but expressions of a genuinely different understanding of what their relationship to Britain should be, because if they meant what they said, the situation was not a law enforcement problem. It was a political problem, and political problems of that kind do not have military solutions. One night, in April of 1775, George III sat in London, while 700 British soldiers marched through the darkness toward a village called Lexington, ordered there to seize weapons that colonial militias had been stockpiling. He had authorized the action. He believed it was necessary. He believed a firm, decisive demonstration of British resolve would accomplish what years of legislation had not. He did not know the names of the men waiting on the green at Lexington. He did not know about the quality of April light in Massachusetts, or the way frost still lay on the ground before dawn, or the sound a musket makes at close range in an open field. He knew the principle. The principle required that this be done, and so it was done. And the shot was fired, and the war began. And for the next 8 years, the principle and the reality of it would grind against each other until one of them broke. It was not the principle that broke, it was everything else. April 19th, 1775, 4:30 in the morning. The village of Lexington, Massachusetts, was still dark when the British column arrived. 700 soldiers, some of the best trained troops in the British Army, had marched through the night from Boston on orders to reach the town of Concord and seize the weapons that colonial militias had been storing there. Go in, confiscate the weapons, come back. The officers expected no serious resistance. What they found at Lexington was 77 men, farmers, mostly, a blacksmith, a shoemaker, a tavern keeper, men who had been roused from their beds by riders moving through the dark to warn that the regulars were coming. These 77 men had assembled on the village green, and they were waiting. Their commander, Captain John Parker, understood the arithmetic. 77 against 700. He gave an order that has been quoted in every account of that morning. He told his men to stand their ground, but not to fire first. Someone fired, anyway. No one knows who. British accounts said the colonists fired first. Colonial accounts said the British fired first. Some witnesses said they heard the shot come from behind a stone wall, from someone not in either formation. The investigation that might have settled the question was never conducted with the rigor it would have required. 8 colonists died on the green at Lexington. 1 British soldier was wounded. The column continued to Concord, found that most of the weapons had already been moved, and turned back toward Boston. And then the day became something else entirely. The militias had been assembling since before dawn. Word spreading from town to town faster than the British column could march. By the time the redcoats were on the road back to Boston, several thousand colonial militiamen had gathered along the route. They did not stand in the open and fight in formations the way military training of the era prescribed. They used the landscape. They fired from behind stone walls and trees and the windows of houses. They moved parallel to the column and ahead of it and around it. The British soldiers, trained for European battlefields where armies faced each other in open ground, found themselves in something they did not have a name for. By the time the column reached safety that evening, 273 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. 95 colonists were dead or wounded. It had been a single day. The news travelled fast in both directions. In the colonies, riders carried the account of what had happened at Lexington and Concord with the specific emphasis that the colonial committees of correspondence had learned to apply. The British had fired first. The redcoats had come in the night to disarm free citizens. The King's soldiers had shed American blood on American soil. In London, the reports that arrived weeks later described an ambush, a mob, the treachery of colonists who would not stand and fight like soldiers. Both accounts contained truth. Both accounts were shaped by what the people telling them needed the story to mean. Samuel Adams had been awake before the riders came. He was in Lexington that night, having been warned that the British had orders to arrest him. When he heard the shots in the distance, he is reported to have said, with a satisfaction that strikes some readers as chilling and others as simply honest, that it was a fine day. Adams had been working toward this for years, not toward the deaths specifically, but toward the moment of rupture, the moment when the argument crossed from the realm of petitions and pamphlets into something that could not be undone with an apology and a repeal. As long as the conflict remained political, Britain retained the advantage of legitimacy. It was still their empire. The colonists were still their subjects. The relationship could still, theoretically, be repaired. Once blood was on the ground, the calculation changed entirely. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress assembled. George Washington was appointed commander of what was now being called the Continental Army. The delegates who gathered in that city in May of 1775 were not all committed to independence. Most still hoped that the fighting could be contained, that Britain would negotiate, that some arrangement short of full separation was still possible. But they were meeting as representatives of something that was behaving increasingly like a sovereign body. They were raising an army. They were managing foreign affairs. They were making the decisions that governments make. George III received the news of Lexington and Concord in May of 1775 and responded immediately and consistently with everything that had come before. This was rebellion. Rebellion had to be suppressed. The appropriate response to rebellion was force, applied swiftly and decisively enough to make the cost of continuing higher than the cost of surrender. He increased the military presence in the colonies. He hired German mercenaries from the principalities of Hesse and Brunswick, a decision that outraged the colonists and handed the patriot propagandists one of their most effective arguments, that the king was willing to use foreign soldiers against his own subjects. He authorized naval blockades. He pushed Parliament for more resources and more men. What he did not do was ask whether there was something about the situation that force could not resolve. Bunker Hill in June of 1775 gave him a data point he chose to read in the wrong direction. The British won the battle, holding the position against 2 colonial assaults. Technically, a victory, but the cost was staggering. More than 200 British soldiers killed, nearly 800 wounded, in a battle for a hill that had no particular strategic value. The colonial militiamen had stood in earthworks and fired with an accuracy and a steadiness that professional soldiers had not expected. General Gage, the British commander in Boston, sent a dispatch to London that tried to convey what this meant. He wrote that the rebels were not the rabble that had been described to the ministry. They were a determined people who would defend their positions to a degree that European military experience did not prepare one for. George III replaced Gage with General Howe. The replacement was not unreasonable. Gage had been unable to break out of Boston, and the army needed more energy. But the replacement also allowed the king and the ministry to set aside the substance of what Gage had said, which was that this was not a problem that would be solved by sending better generals. In August of 1775, George III issued the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. It declared the colonies in a state of rebellion and called on loyal subjects throughout the empire to report treason and assist in its suppression. It closed the door on any official negotiation with the Continental Congress. It defined the conflict, formally and publicly, as a domestic law enforcement matter. He issued the proclamation before he had read the Olive Branch petition. That petition, which John Dickinson had written and the Congress had signed, and sent across the Atlantic as one last attempt to reach the king over the heads of his ministers, was sitting somewhere in the transatlantic postal system when the proclamation was drafted. It arrived afterward. It asked the king to intervene personally, to halt the punishing policies and open a genuine dialogue. George III declined to receive it officially. It received no formal response. The men who had signed it, who had staked the moderate position on the belief that the king might still be reachable, learned what that silence meant. They learned it at different speeds and with different degrees of reluctance. But they all learned it, and one of them sat down in a rented room in Philadelphia and took out a piece of paper. He has. John Dickinson did not want to write the Declaration of Independence. He did not want anyone to write it. He had spent the better part of a year arguing, in the Continental Congress, and in private letters, and in conversations that stretched late into the Philadelphia nights, that independence was the wrong answer. Not because he thought George III was right, not because he believed the colonial grievances were manufactured. He believed they were real and serious and deserving of a solution. He simply did not believe that the solution was separation. Dickinson was 43 years old in the summer of 1775. He had been a central figure in colonial politics for more than a decade. The author of the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania that had made the constitutional argument against parliamentary taxation more clearly than almost anyone else had managed. He was not a timid man, or an accommodating one. He had principles, and he held them. His principle on independence was this: Britain and the colonies were in a conflict about constitutional authority that was genuine and serious. But they were also bound together by language and law and culture and commerce in ways that a war of separation would tear apart, with consequences no one could fully predict. An independent America would not automatically be a free America. It would be a new nation, vulnerable to foreign powers, dependent on whatever alliances it could secure, facing the enormous practical difficulties of governing a diverse population across an enormous territory without the institutional framework that had taken Britain centuries to develop. He thought the risks were too great. He thought the moderate path, some arrangement that gave the colonies meaningful self-governance while keeping them within the British Empire, was still possible. He was running out of time to be right about that. The Olive Branch petition had been his idea, or close to it. In July of 1775, with the fighting at Lexington and Concord 2 months past, and Bunker Hill a fresh wound, Dickinson persuaded the Congress to send one more communication directly to the king. Not to Parliament, not to the ministry, to George III himself, appealing over the heads of everyone who had managed the colonial policy and asking the king to intervene personally, to stop what was happening and open real negotiations. The petition was respectful in its tone and specific in its requests. It acknowledged the king's authority. It expressed loyalty to the crown. It asked, with the formal deference that the moment required, that the king hear the grievances of his American subjects and act to address them before the conflict became something that neither side could pull back from. Dickinson believed in it. He put everything he had into the language. He genuinely thought that if the king could be made to understand, through a direct and honest communication that bypassed the ministers who had been managing the information he received, that there was still a population of loyal subjects in America who wanted reconciliation, the king might act. He was wrong about George III. George III issued the Proclamation of Rebellion before the Olive Branch petition arrived in London. He declined to receive it through official channels. The petition that Dickinson had staked the moderate position on was treated, in London, as a document from rebels, and rebels were not entitled to formal responses from the Crown. When the news reached Philadelphia, it landed differently on different people. For John Adams, who had believed for months that independence was the only honest position, the rejection confirmed what he already knew. He had thought the petition was a mistake from the beginning, a delay that served no purpose except to give the moderates a last hope that could be extinguished cleanly. Now it had been extinguished. He could move forward. For Dickinson, the rejection was something harder to process. He had not been naive about the odds. He had known they were long, but he had believed they were real. And now he had to reckon with the fact that the king, the specific man to whom he had appealed as a last resort, had not found them worth addressing. He spent the winter of 1775 into 1776 watching the consensus in the Congress move, steadily and then rapidly, toward independence. Thomas Paine published Common Sense in January of 1776, and the reception of that pamphlet told Dickinson everything he needed to know about where public sentiment had gone. People read it and passed it and quoted it in the way people engage with a text that says clearly what they have been feeling without being able to say, Paine called monarchy an absurdity and hereditary succession a joke and George III a tyrant. And hundreds of thousands of people found those words not shocking but obvious. Dickinson was not moved. He thought Paine was brilliant and reckless and right about too many things to be safely ignored and wrong about the most important thing, which was the practical question of what came after independence was declared. The vote on independence came in July of 1776. Dickinson spoke against it one more time, making his argument as he had been making it for a year, about the risks and the uncertainties and the possibility of arrangements short of full separation. The people who heard him said afterward that he spoke well and that it made no difference. He did not vote for independence. He did not vote against it. He absented himself from the chamber on the day of the final vote, because the thing he had argued against was going to happen regardless of his vote, and he could not bring himself to endorse it or to make a futile gesture of opposition. He enlisted in the Continental Army the following month. He fought at the Battle of Brandywine. He served his country in the war whose necessity he had disputed. Because whatever his views on independence, his identity as an American was not something he was willing to abandon. History has not been entirely fair to John Dickinson. He appears in the story of the founding as a hesitator, a man who got in the way of the obvious right answer. But he was asking real questions. The problems he identified, the difficulties of governing a new nation, the risks of foreign entanglement, the fragility of a republic trying to sustain itself across a vast and varied geography, turned out to be exactly as serious as he said they were. The founders spent the next decade struggling with all of them. He was wrong about independence. He was right about almost everything that came after it. On the other side of the Atlantic, in London, George III received word that the colonies had formally declared independence. He read the document. He read the accusations. He read his own name, placed at the center of every grievance, made responsible for every harm. He did not recognize himself in it. That is not a defense of him. It is something more complicated and more human than a defense. It is the record of a man who had spent 16 years doing what he believed was right, who had acted from principle and duty and genuine conviction about what the empire required, and who found, in the document from Philadelphia, a portrait of a tyrant that bore no resemblance to the man he understood himself to be. He ordered the military campaign intensified. He was not going to let them go, because a king did not let them go, because duty was not conditional on success, because the woman who raised him had told him what he had to be. From the time he was 12 years old, and the whole weight of the crown had fallen on him without warning. Be a king. He was going to be a king, whatever it cost. In the spring of 1753, a 21-year-old Virginian named George Washington rode into the wilderness of the Ohio Valley, carrying a message from the governor of Virginia to the French military commanders who had been building forts on land that Britain claimed as its own. He was young, ambitious, physically impressive in the way that people who spent their lives outdoors in the 18th century sometimes were. And he wanted, more than almost anything else at that point in his life, to be recognized as a British officer, not a colonial militia officer, a real British officer, with a royal commission and the standing that came with it, and the future that it implied. The British Army declined. The reasons were administrative on the surface. Colonial officers held lower rank than regular army officers of the same grade. The hierarchy of the empire placed Virginia planters, however capable, below officers who had purchased their commissions in Britain. Washington appealed the decision more than once, through more than one channel, with the persistence of a young man who believes the obstacle in front of him is temporary and can be argued away. It was not temporary. He resigned his commission in 1758 and went home to Mount Vernon. This detail sits quietly in the early chapters of Washington's biography and is easy to treat as a footnote. It was not a footnote. It was the first lesson in a long education about what the British Empire actually thought of the people it governed in America, which was that they were useful, they were valued, and they were not quite fully British, and the distinction between those things was not going to be softened by talent or ambition or service. Washington did not become a revolutionary because of this experience alone. The path from disappointed commission seeker to commander of the Continental Army ran through 20 years of additional experience. Through reading and farming and serving in the Virginia Assembly and watching the colonial crisis develop from the perspective of a man with land and money and more to lose than most from an open break with Britain. He was not an impulsive man. He moved slowly and he thought carefully, and he did not arrive at positions until he had turned them over thoroughly enough to be sure of them. By 1775, when the Congress appointed him commander of the Continental Army, he was sure. George III was sitting on a throne in London. George Washington was going to take everything the first George had built in North America and see whether it could become something that had never quite existed before. Two men named George, born within a decade of each other, raised in different worlds, but inside the same broad civilization, the same language, the same legal tradition, the same inherited understanding of what British liberty meant and why it mattered. They had never met. They would never meet. But for 8 years, they would be the central figures in a contest that neither of them had designed and that both of them understood, in their different ways, to be about something larger than territory or taxes. It was about what power was for. The war that Washington fought was not the war that military textbooks describe. He lost more battles than he won. He spent the winter of 1777 into 1778 at Valley Forge with an army that was starving and freezing and deserting in numbers that would have broken a different kind of commander. His soldiers did not have enough shoes. They did not have enough food. The Congress that had appointed him was perpetually short of money and perpetually slow to provide what the army needed. He held it together, not through brilliance. Exactly. Though he was capable of brilliant strokes, not through inspiring speeches. Though he could write powerfully when the occasion required, he held it together through something harder to name and more difficult to sustain, a quality of presence that communicated to everyone around him that he was not going to quit, and that his not quitting was not stubbornness or desperation, but a considered judgment that the thing they were doing was worth the cost of doing it. His soldiers felt this. The accounts that survive from Valley Forge describe a camp that should have collapsed and did not, and the explanations that the survivors gave, decades later, almost always came back to Washington. He was there. He was visible. He was suffering the same conditions his men were suffering, or close enough that the difference did not feel like the difference between a general and his troops, but like the difference between the man in front and the men behind him. George III managed his war from palaces. This is not a criticism in the simple sense. Kings did not go to the front lines. The logistics of royal command required that the king remain in London, receiving dispatches, meeting with ministers, making decisions about strategy and resources. George III was conscientious about this work. He read everything. He asked questions. He pushed his ministers for better information and faster action. By the standards of 18th century royal war management, he was engaged and attentive, but he was 3,000 miles away, and the information he received was weeks old when it arrived, and the reality of the war on the ground in New Jersey or South Carolina or Virginia was something he could understand only as a description, never as an experience. He knew what his generals told him. His generals told him what they thought he needed to know, filtered through their own interests and their own assessments of what was possible. Washington knew what he could see from his own horse. That difference is not the whole explanation for why Britain lost and America won. It is part of it. After the British surrender at Yorktown in October of 1781, after the treaty negotiations, after the formal recognition of American independence in 1783, Washington did something that no one in London had thought he would do. He resigned on December 23, 1783. George Washington appeared before the Continental Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, and returned his commission as commander of the Continental Army. He gave a short speech. He thanked his officers. He said the war had demanded much of those who served in it. He handed over the document that gave him command of the most powerful military force in North America, turned around, and rode home to Mount Vernon. The room was in tears. Some of the delegates who watched it happen wrote about it afterward with the particular intensity of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a long time. They were right about that. The significance of what Washington did that day is easiest to see in contrast. In the 18th century, the commander who wins a revolution does not typically give up the army. He uses the army. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Napoleon seized power from the Directory. Cromwell dissolved Parliament. The pattern was ancient, and it was clear, and it was what almost everyone who watched the American Revolution from Europe expected would happen when it was over. Washington broke the pattern completely and deliberately and, by every account, without significant internal struggle. He did not want to be a king. He did not want to be a dictator. He wanted to go home and farm and live as a private citizen in a country where private citizens had the rights that the revolution had been fought to secure. George III was informed, somewhere in the period after Yorktown, of Washington's decision to resign his command. The account of what he said comes from Benjamin West, the American painter who was living in London at the time. According to West, the king asked him what Washington would do now that he had won the war. West told him that Washington intended to return to his farm. George III was quiet for a moment. Then he said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. Sit with that for a moment. The king who had spent 8 years fighting Washington, who had called him and his countrymen rebels and traitors, who had committed the full military power of the British Empire to defeating him, said that if Washington walked away from power after winning, he would be the greatest man in the world. He said it because he understood what it meant. He understood it because he was, whatever his failures as a political leader, an intelligent man who had thought seriously about power and what it did to people and what it required of them. He knew what it cost to hold power. He knew the forces that pulled at you when you had it. The advisors with their interests and the factions with their agendas, and the constant pressure of people who needed things from you and were willing to tell you whatever you wanted to hear. He had been unable to put that down. He had never wanted to put it down. Washington had understood something different. He had understood that the power was not his. It belonged to the country. He had held it on loan for the purpose the country required. And when that purpose was accomplished, the loan was over. That understanding is the difference between what George III built and what George Washington built. One built an empire held together by authority, asserted from the center. The other built a republic on the principle that authority flows from the people who consent to be governed by it. The empire is gone. The republic is still here. On the morning of August 27th, 1776, a 19-year-old private named Joseph Martin stood on the Brooklyn Heights and watched the British Army coming across the fields toward him. And he understood, with the specific clarity that comes from being 19 years old and in immediate danger, that the thing he had enlisted for 6 weeks earlier was considerably more serious than he had imagined when he enlisted. He had signed up in Connecticut because the pay was good, and because, in the summer of 1776, the war still felt like the kind of thing that happened at a distance and resolved itself quickly in favor of the right side. He had marched to New York. He had listened to officers give speeches about liberty and the rights of man, and now he was watching 8,000 British soldiers in red coats advance across Long Island in formations so precise and so numerous that the word army suddenly meant something entirely different from what it had meant before. He ran. He was not the only one. The Continental forces on Long Island broke under the British assault and fell back toward the water. And what should have been the destruction of Washington's army and the effective end of the war became, instead, one of the great escapes of military history. Washington evacuating his troops across the East River in the night in boats manned by Massachusetts fishermen who could not be heard over the sound of the wind. Joseph Martin survived. He would go on to serve for the entire duration of the war, through Valley Forge and Monmouth and the siege of Yorktown, and he would write about it decades later in a memoir that is the most vivid account of what the revolution felt like from the ground, from the perspective of a man who was cold and hungry and tired and scared, and who kept showing up anyway. His memoir does not contain a great deal of constitutional theory. Lord North did not want to be Prime Minister during any of this. He had accepted the position in 1770 because George III had asked him to, and because declining the King's direct request was not something that a man of North's temperament found easy to do. He was intelligent, good-humoured, self-deprecating in the way that very capable people sometimes are, and he understood the colonial situation with a clarity that his public positions did not always reflect. He understood, specifically, that it was probably not going to end well. He said as much in private. More than once, he told the king, in letters that have survived, that he did not believe he was the right man for the job. He told him that the American situation required qualities he was not sure he possessed, and that the policies he was being asked to implement were more likely to make things worse than better. He asked, repeatedly, to be allowed to resign. George III would not let him go. This arrangement, a capable minister implementing a policy he privately doubted on behalf of a king who was certain he was right, shaped the British management of the war in ways that cannot be separated from its outcome. The decisions that came out of London were not the decisions of a government fully committed to a strategy it believed in. They were the decisions of a government divided between what the king required and what the evidence suggested. General William Howe arrived in the colonies as a man with a complicated inheritance. He had the authority to fight the war and also the authority, under a separate peace commission, to offer terms of reconciliation under certain conditions. He was simultaneously fighting a war and theoretically open to not fighting it. This is not an arrangement that produces decisive military action. After Long Island, after that morning when Joseph Martin ran and Washington's army nearly ceased to exist, Howe had Washington's forces in a position to be destroyed. The military logic of the situation called for an immediate assault. Howe ordered his men to dig siege works instead. Washington evacuated his army across the river in the night. Howe's reasons have been debated by historians ever since. He was cautious by nature. He may have believed that a complete military defeat of Washington would make reconciliation impossible. He may have simply underestimated what his hesitation was costing. Whatever the reason, the pattern repeated itself across the next year. Opportunities closed. Washington survived. The war continued. In London, George III received reports that emphasized the victories and softened the failures, filtered through ministers who understood that bad news delivered too sharply tends to damage the messenger. He knew that Howe had won at Long Island. He did not fully understand, not clearly, not with the emphasis the situation deserved, that the battle had failed to accomplish its decisive purpose. He should have been told. He was not. Then came Burgoyne. General John Burgoyne was the kind of officer who existed in the 18th century as a distinct type, charming, confident, well-connected, a writer of plays and a presence in London society. A man who had been successful enough in his military career to believe that the next success was always within reach. He had a plan for the 1777 campaign season that he had presented to the ministry in London, and that had been approved with the enthusiasm that plans receive when the people approving them are not going to be the ones executing them. The plan was to march south from Canada through the Lake Champlain Valley and split New England off from the rest of the colonies. Sound on a map. The execution required 2 columns to coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles of wilderness without reliable communications or adequate supply lines. Burgoyne moved south from Canada in June of 1777 with nearly 8,000 men. The supply lines stretched and then broke. A detachment sent to raid for horses and supplies was destroyed at Bennington by Vermont militiamen under John Stark, who told his men before the battle that they would defeat the British that day, or his wife would sleep a widow that night. They defeated the British that day. By the time Burgoyne's depleted and hungry army reached Saratoga in September, they were surrounded. The relief column from New York had never materialized. On October 17th, 1777, 5,895 British and Hessian soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest British military surrender in a century. In London, Lord North told the king they needed to reconsider everything. The king disagreed. He said the war would continue. He was not being entirely irrational. Britain had more men, more money, more naval power than the Americans could hope to match. The war could still be won if the right strategy was found and the right commanders were in the field to execute it. What George III could not account for was what Saratoga meant to the courts of Europe. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris. He had been there since the end of 1776, living in the village of Passy outside the city, conducting the most important diplomatic mission of his life. He was famous in France before he arrived. His experiments with electricity, his philosophical writings, his general embodiment of Enlightenment ideals had made him a figure of fascination in French intellectual circles. He was also, with calm and patient brilliance, asking the French government for something specific. France had been watching the American War with the attention of a country that had lost a great deal to Britain in the 7 Years' War, and was interested in any opportunity to recover some of what it had lost. The Americans were interesting but fragile. The French had been providing covert assistance, but they were not ready to commit openly. Saratoga changed the arithmetic. An American army had defeated and captured a British army. This was not a colonial rabble throwing tea into a harbour. This was a military force capable of winning set-piece battles against professional soldiers. If France was going to bet on the Americans, Saratoga was the moment when the odds had shifted enough to justify the bet. In February of 1778, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. The American War became a world war on the day those treaties were signed. France moved forces into the Caribbean. Spain joined the conflict the following year. The Dutch followed. Britain suddenly faced threats on multiple fronts that required forces and attention that could not all be devoted to the American theatre. The war that George III had been fighting as a domestic law enforcement problem had become something that required the full mobilization of British imperial resources against multiple enemies across multiple oceans. He replaced Howe with Henry Clinton. He pushed Parliament for more money, more men, more ships. He told Lord North that the war would be won and that losing was not an option. Lord North told him, in a private letter that year, that he believed the war was effectively lost and begged once more to be allowed to resign. The king told him to stay. He stayed. And, somewhere in the South, in the Carolinas and Virginia, the final act was already beginning to take shape. Joseph Martin was still showing up. He was cold and he was hungry, and he did not entirely understand the constitutional principles for which he was fighting. But he understood the men fighting beside him, and the ground under his feet, and the particular quality of stubbornness that keeps a person moving forward when every reasonable calculation says to stop. That stubbornness, multiplied across an army, across 8 years, across a continent, was something that George III, in his palace in London, reading his filtered dispatches and maintaining his principles, had never quite managed to account for. It was going to cost him everything. Benjamin Franklin owned one suit in Paris. This was a choice, not a poverty. Franklin was a wealthy man by the standards of the American colonies, and Paris, in 1776, was a city where wealth displayed itself with an enthusiasm that bordered on religion. The French aristocracy wore silk and powder and jewels to afternoon gatherings. The salons where ideas were debated and reputations made were places where appearances carried enormous weight. Franklin wore brown wool and a fur cap and no wig. He understood something about the moment he was in that a lesser diplomat might have missed. France did not need to be convinced that Britain was powerful. France did not need to be convinced that the American colonies had legitimate grievances. What France needed, in order to make the decision that Franklin was there to ask them to make, was to believe that America was real, that it was not simply a collection of aggrieved merchants and angry farmers who would collapse at the first serious military pressure, but something genuine, something new, something worth betting on. Franklin's brown suit said, "We are not performing Europe for you. We are something else. Something you have not seen before." The salons of Paris received him with the fascination that European intellectuals reserve for ideas that confirm what they already want to believe. The philosophes had been writing for decades about natural man and the corruption of civilization and the possibility of a society built on reason rather than tradition. Here, in the person of this 70-year-old man, with his fur cap and his gentle wit and his extraordinary mind, was a living argument that such a society might actually be possible. He was celebrated everywhere. When he walked into a room, the conversation reorganized itself around him. He used all of it with complete deliberateness. In his letters home during this period, Franklin described the diplomatic situation with the dry precision of a man who had been watching human nature long enough to find it more interesting than surprising. He wrote that the French wanted to help America, but needed a reason that was better than wanting to hurt Britain. Because openly entering a war against Britain required a justification that French honor could sustain. He wrote that he was providing that justification, carefully, patiently, one conversation and one salon and one carefully managed public appearance at a time. What he needed from the battlefield was a victory, not a skirmish, not a defensive success. A victory large enough and clear enough that the French government could point to it and say that these people can win, that these people are worth the risk. Saratoga gave him that. The news arrived in Paris in early December of 1777 and moved through the city with the speed of something that changes the room it enters. 5,895 British soldiers had laid down their arms in upstate New York. A British general had surrendered to an American general. This was not supposed to be possible. The British Army was the finest professional military force in the world. The Americans were, in the understanding of most European observers, farmers with muskets and a grievance. The farmers with muskets had just captured an entire British army. Franklin received the news and did not celebrate publicly, which was itself a kind of statement. He allowed the news to do its work while he waited for the questions he knew would follow. The questions came within days. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, who had been moving toward alliance with America for months, but had not been able to cross the final threshold, now crossed it. In February of 1778, France signed a treaty of amity and commerce and a treaty of alliance with the United States of America. The Treaty of Alliance committed France to fighting alongside America until American independence was achieved and prohibited either party from making a separate peace with Britain. The American War became a world war on the day those treaties were signed. Spain entered the conflict in 1779, not as an ally of America but as an ally of France, with its own grievances against Britain and its own territorial ambitions in the Gulf of Mexico and along the Mississippi. The Dutch followed in 1780. Britain now faced enemies in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of India, and in the waters around the British Isles themselves. The French Navy, rebuilt since the 7 Years' War, was capable of challenging British naval supremacy in ways that no one in London had anticipated when the American troubles began. The war that George III had been fighting as a domestic law enforcement problem had become something that required the full mobilization of British imperial resources against multiple enemies across multiple oceans. In London, the political consequences of Saratoga were immediate and severe. Lord North told the king, with the urgency of a man who had been saying the same thing for years and finally felt the harshness of his language was justified, that the war could not be continued on its current terms. He proposed concessions to the Americans that would have given them almost everything they had asked for before 1779. 76. Effective self-governance. Control over their own taxation. Everything short of complete independence. He believed that in 1778, a substantial portion of the American population would have accepted those terms. George III refused the concessions. His reasoning was the reasoning he had applied at every previous decision point. Yielding under pressure was not negotiation. It was surrender. It taught the Americans, and every other part of the empire that was watching, that sufficient defiance would always be rewarded. He was consistent. He had been consistent from the beginning. Parliament sent a peace commission to America in the spring of 1778. The commission was authorized to offer terms that would have been extraordinary if they had been offered in 1775. Full repeal of the Townshend duties. Effective recognition of the Continental Congress. The right to local self-governance on virtually all domestic matters. The Congress rejected the commission without substantive discussion. They rejected it because France was now their ally. They rejected it because the Declaration of Independence had committed them to full independence in a document they could not set aside without repudiating everything that had happened since July of 1776. They also rejected it because they no longer trusted Britain to keep any promises it made. That trust had been spent, slowly and then completely. Over 15 years of policies that had said one thing and done another. Trust, once gone, does not return because the offer improves. The war continued. Henry Clinton replaced Howe as British commander. The strategy shifted south to the Carolinas and Georgia, where Loyalist support was believed to be stronger and where the British hoped to peel the southern colonies away from the rebellion. The strategy produced victories. Savannah fell, Charleston fell, and with it 5,500 American soldiers, the largest American defeat of the war. Cornwallis moved through the Carolinas winning battles, and finding that winning battles did not produce the Loyalist uprising, the strategy had assumed. The Loyalists were there. They were real, but they were operating in a society where choosing the British side meant exposure to retaliation from patriot neighbours. And the British forces could not protect them everywhere all the time. The Southern strategy worked as a military proposition and failed as a political one, for the same reason that every British strategy in America had ultimately failed as a political proposition. You cannot force people to want to be governed by you. George III, receiving the reports from the Southern campaign, saw victories. He saw Savannah. He saw Charleston. He saw the maps showing British forces moving through territory that had previously been controlled by the rebels. He did not see clearly enough what Cornwallis was beginning to see from the ground. Cornwallis wrote to Clinton in the spring of 1781 that he believed the Southern campaign could not succeed without naval superiority and without a secure base from which to operate. He was moving his army toward the Virginia coast, toward a place where the York River met the Chesapeake Bay. He needed the navy to protect his position. He moved his army to Yorktown and waited. The French navy arrived first. William Franklin was 50 years old in the autumn of 1782, sitting in a room in London, working on a memoir he would never finish. And the thing he was trying to figure out how to write about was his father. Benjamin Franklin was 76 years old. Also, in the autumn of 1782, sitting in a house in Passy, outside Paris, negotiating the peace treaty that would formally end the American War and create the United States of America. He was one of the most celebrated men in the Western world. He had helped write the Declaration of Independence. He had won the French alliance. He had, more than almost any other single person, made the American Revolution succeed. His son had spent 2 years in an American prison for refusing to support it. The story of the Franklins is the story of the American Revolution that the Revolution does not like to tell about itself. It is the story of a civil war inside families. The story of people who looked at the same situation and reached different conclusions and paid different prices and never quite forgave each other for it. William Franklin had grown up in his father's shadow and had spent his adult life both benefiting from that shadow and trying to step out of it. Benjamin had secured him the appointment as Royal Governor of New Jersey in 1763, a prestigious position that William had discharged with genuine devotion to the job. He was not a bad governor. He was not a corrupt one. He believed in the British imperial system with the sincere conviction of a man who had built his career inside it and understood it to be, whatever its flaws, the most functional political structure available. When the war came, he stayed loyal. He stayed loyal after his father made clear that loyalty to the crown meant disloyalty to the family. He stayed loyal after he was arrested by Patriot forces in 1776 and held without trial for 2 years in conditions that damaged his health. He stayed loyal after he was exchanged and made his way to New York, where he organized the Associated Loyalists, a paramilitary organization that conducted raids against Patriot communities. He went to London in 1782, when it was clear the British were going to lose, and he spent the rest of his life there, a man without a country, writing letters to his father that asked for reconciliation and received answers that were carefully, painfully civil and nothing more. They met once more in 1785 in Southampton, when Benjamin was passing through England on his way home from Paris. The meeting lasted several days. William hoped for something. What he got was the formal cordiality of a father who had decided that the choices his son had made were not the kind that could be discussed past a certain depth without reopening wounds that had not healed. Benjamin Franklin's will, written shortly before his death in 1790, left William the lands in Nova Scotia that the British government had granted him as compensation for his losses. It left him nothing else. The will noted that the lands would have been more, but that William's political conduct had reduced the elder Franklin's ability to assist him. He had not been forgiven. The question of who was right in the specific family argument that became a symbol of the larger national argument is not a question that has a clean answer. William Franklin had made a choice based on his assessment of where his obligations lay and what the likely outcome of the conflict would be. And he had been wrong about the outcome and held to the obligations in a way that made him, in the end, the man who lost everything while his father was celebrated as one of the founders of a new world. He died in London in 1813. 30 years after the country he had refused to betray had become a country he could not return to. Across the colonies, from Massachusetts to Georgia, the story of families divided by the Revolution was not unusual. It was common enough to be, in a different kind of history, one of the defining experiences of the founding. Fathers and sons, brothers, neighbors who had known each other for decades. The Revolution asked everyone to choose, and the choosing broke things that had not been broken before and could not be fully repaired after. The people who chose Britain were not, most of them, the villains that Patriot history made them. They were people who believed in the empire for reasons that were sometimes self-interested and sometimes principled and sometimes a mixture they themselves could not have separated cleanly. They believed the rebellion would fail. They believed that independence, if it succeeded, would produce chaos and vulnerability to foreign powers that the protection of the British Empire had prevented. Some of these beliefs were wrong. Some were more right than the victor's history acknowledges. Approximately 60,000 Loyalists left the United States in the years following the peace treaty. They went to Canada, to the Caribbean, to Britain. They called themselves United Empire Loyalists and carried with them the culture and the political assumptions of the colonial world they had come from, building communities in Nova Scotia and Ontario that were, in a specific sense, the American colonies that had chosen to remain British. Canada exists, in part, because of them. Thomas Peters, whom we met earlier in this story, ended the war in Nova Scotia with thousands of others who had made the same choice he had, living on the poorest land, receiving the smallest allocations. The last people anyone in the new arrangements thought about. The British government had promised them land. The land they received was the worst available, rocky and thin, and far from the established settlements where work could be found and communities had already formed. The white Loyalists, who had arrived with more resources and more connections, received better land and more of it. The hierarchy of the old society reproduced itself in exile. Peters went to London to present a petition to the government on behalf of the black Loyalists of Nova Scotia. He argued their case in offices where no one had expected to see him. He won enough to organize an exodus. In 1792, 12 ships carried more than 1,000 black Loyalists from Halifax to Sierra Leone. They were returning, in a specific and limited sense, to the continent their ancestors had been taken from, going not as captives but as free people, which was what Dunmore's proclamation had promised them, and what, after 15 years of fighting and waiting and surviving on bad land in a cold province, they were finally, partially, going to receive. Peters died in Sierra Leone 4 months after arriving. He was somewhere in his mid-50s. Fever, the ordinary mortality of a new settlement in a tropical climate, the kind of death that claims people who have survived extraordinary things and then are undone by ordinary ones. He had crossed the Atlantic twice in chains, and once as a free man. He had fought in a war, survived hardship, raised a family, navigated a bureaucracy designed to ignore him, and led 1,000 people across an ocean to a home they had never seen. He chose freedom where he could find it. That is not a small thing to say about a person. That is, in fact, everything. George III never adequately acknowledged what the Loyalists had sacrificed for him. The compensation the British government paid to those who lost property was slow and incomplete, and administered with the indifference of a bureaucracy handling a category of problem it found inconvenient rather than urgent. Many Loyalists spent years navigating a claims process that returned a fraction of what they had lost, the king who they had remained loyal to, at the cost of their homes and their communities and their families, received their loyalty and moved on to other concerns. This is one of the things the Declaration of Independence did not say about George III, not because it was not true, but because it was a kind of failing that did not fit the narrative the Declaration was constructing. The Declaration needed a tyrant, a man who fails to adequately care for the people who loved him too much is something more complicated than a tyrant, and the summer of 1776 was not a moment for complicated. The summer of 1781, however, was about to deliver something that even the most carefully managed narrative could not simplify. Yorktown was coming. The French fleet arrived first. This is the detail that everything else depends on, the thing that made Yorktown inevitable before a single siege gun was fired. And it is worth staying with for a moment, because it illustrates something true about how wars are actually decided, which is rarely the way the most famous battles suggest. In the late summer of 1781, A French admiral named François-Joseph Paul de Grasse sailed a fleet of 28 ships of the line into the Chesapeake Bay. He was coming from the Caribbean, where the French had been conducting their own war against British interests. And he was coming because Washington and the French general Rochambeau had sent him a letter explaining that Cornwallis was at Yorktown, that Yorktown could be trapped if the sea approach was closed, and that closing the sea approach required a French fleet, de Grasse Armée. On September 5, 1781, a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake to find de Grasse already there. The two fleets fought for 2 hours in an engagement called the Battle of the Chesapeake. Neither fleet was destroyed. Both were damaged. When the fighting stopped, the British withdrew to New York to repair their ships. They did not come back. Cornwallis was now at Yorktown, with approximately 8,000 men, a defensible position on a peninsula between the York River and the James River, waiting for the relief that the British Naval Command in New York had promised him. The relief required naval superiority in the Chesapeake. The naval superiority was gone. He wrote to Clinton in New York, describing his situation with the precise, unsparing language of a professional soldier who has done the calculation and arrived at an answer he does not want to report. He needed ships. He needed them soon. The combined French and American force arriving outside his walls was considerably larger than his own. Clinton sent word that ships were being prepared. The ships were delayed. The delays accumulated. Washington arrived at Yorktown on September 28th and looked at what he had. His own continental troops. The core of an army he had held together through 7 years of defeats and near defeats, and winters that should have destroyed it. French regulars under Rochambeau, professional soldiers with artillery that the American forces could not have matched on their own, and the French fleet in the bay behind them, making retreat by sea impossible for the British, and resupply impossible, and relief impossible, unless the British Navy returned in strength. He ordered the siege to begin. What followed was methodical and professional and, in the specific, technical sense, almost routine. The Allied forces dug trenches, advanced them, dug more. They brought up artillery and destroyed the British outer works. They assaulted 2 British redoubts on the night of October 14th, the Americans taking one, the French taking the other. With the speed and coordination that Washington had been trying to achieve for 7 years, Joseph Martin was in the assault on Redoubt 10. He wrote about it later with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who had seen enough combat that dramatic language seemed beside the point. They went in fast, with unloaded muskets because they could not afford a misfire alerting the garrison. Relying on bayonets, the men in front cut through the abattis, the sharpened stakes protecting the outer works, with their bare hands in some cases. They were inside the redoubt in about 10 minutes. Martin counted the wounded afterward and did not write down how he felt about the number. Cornwallis attempted a counter-attack on October 16th that failed. He attempted to evacuate his army across the York River to Gloucester in the night, hoping to break out and march north, and a storm came up and scattered his boats before the operation could be completed. On the morning of October 17th, 1781, a British drummer boy climbed to the top of the Yorktown earthworks and beat a signal for parley. Washington, according to accounts from people who were present, heard the drum and went very still for a moment. He had been waiting 7 years to hear that sound. The surrender was negotiated over 2 days and formalized on October 19th. Cornwallis sent word that he was ill and would not attend the ceremony in person. He sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender in his place. O'Hara rode forward toward the Allied commanders. He approached Rochambeau first and made to offer the sword of surrender. Rochambeau gestured toward Washington. O'Hara turned to Washington. Washington, recognizing that O'Hara was a deputy rather than the principal, gestured toward his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln accepted the sword. This small choreography of deflected honors was not accidental. Everyone involved understood that the surrender ceremony was a performance as much as a transaction, and that dignity, the preservation of some form of it, on all sides, was worth the few minutes it took to get the protocol right. The British Army marched out between lines of French and American soldiers to lay down their arms. The band played. Accounts differ on whether the tune was "The World Turned Upside Down," as the most famous versions of the story report, or something else. What the accounts agree on is that the British soldiers looked at the ground as they marched, refusing eye contact with their captors, and that some of them were weeping. Washington wrote to Congress that evening in the formal language of a military dispatch, reporting the surrender and the numbers and the terms. He did not use the occasion to celebrate. He recommended that Congress appoint a day of public thanksgiving. He listed things that still needed to be done. He was already thinking about what came next. In London, Lord North received the news in late November. The famous account of his response describes him walking back and forth across the room saying, "Oh God, it is all over the way a man takes a blow," repeatedly, as if each repetition might reduce the impact. He had known something like this was coming. He had been saying for years it was coming. The knowing did not make it easier. He went to George III. The king received the news with the composure he had trained himself to display in public settings. He did not break down. He did not rage. He thanked North for bringing him the information and dismissed him, and spent the rest of the day in his private apartments. What happened in those hours is not recorded in any document that has survived. What came out of them was a letter. George III wrote an abdication. The document has not survived in complete form, but its existence is attested by enough contemporary sources to be treated as historical fact. What remains of the accounts of its content describes a king who had concluded that he could no longer serve his country in good conscience, that the loss of America had demonstrated a failure of policy that rested ultimately on his own decisions, and that his continuation on the throne would be a disservice to the nation he had sworn to protect. He wrote it. He read it back to himself. Then he put it in a drawer. He did not send it. He did not show it to anyone. He sat with the letter for some period of time, and then he made the decision that his mother had prepared him for from the time he was 12 years old. The decision that had no alternative in the world that Augusta of Saxe-Gotha had built inside her son. He would remain, not because he had convinced himself that Yorktown was something other than what it was, but because a king did not abandon his post, because duty was not conditional on success, because the same sense of obligation that had driven every decision he had made for 21 years on the throne was not going to release him simply because those decisions had led somewhere he had not intended to go. He put the letter in the drawer. Lord North was allowed to resign in March of 1782. He left Downing Street with what people who saw him described as the expression of a man who has put down something very heavy after carrying it too long. George III found a new ministry. He continued to attend to the business of governing a country that had just lost a significant portion of its empire and was trying to understand what came next. Parliament voted in February of 1782 to end offensive operations in America. The peace negotiations conducted in Paris over the better part of a year produced a treaty signed in September of 1783. In that treaty, Britain recognized the independence of the 13 United States of America. It ceded to them all territory east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. It agreed to withdraw its forces. George III signed the treaty. He sat at his desk with the document in front of him for a moment before he signed. What he thought in that moment is not recorded. What he said afterward, in a conversation with his secretary, was that he hoped the United States would find that independence brought with it difficulties they had not anticipated, and that the relationship between the two countries would, in time, become something better than what the war had made of it. It was a generous thing to say. It was also the kind of thing that a man says when he has run out of other things to say. The pen moved across the paper. It was done. John Adams arrived in London in June of 1785, carrying credentials that identified him as the Minister Plenipotentiary of the United States of America to the Court of St. James's. He was the first American ambassador to Britain. He was presenting himself under that title and with that flag to the king who had called him and his countrymen rebels. The king who had sent armies to defeat them, hired foreign soldiers to fight them, blockaded their ports, burned their towns. The king whose name appeared in the Declaration of Independence, which Adams had helped draft, as the author of Tyrannies That Justified Revolution. He was going to bow to that king. This was the protocol. Foreign ambassadors bowed upon being presented at the British court. Adams was a foreign ambassador. He would bow. He prepared for the meeting with the thoroughness he brought to everything, reading accounts of previous presentations, consulting with the diplomatic community in London about what to expect, thinking carefully about what he would say and how he would say it. He was 50 years old, a short and somewhat round man, with a directness of manner that could read as abrasiveness to people who did not know him, and as refreshing honesty to people who did. The audience was held on June 1st, 1785, at St. James's Palace. Adams stood before George III and delivered a prepared speech. As the protocol required, he said that he was sensible of the distinguished honor His Majesty did him in admitting him to an audience, and that he could not help expressing the earnest wishes of the people he represented that the old good nature and the old good humor between their countries might be restored. George III listened. Then he spoke. The conversation that followed lasted about 15 minutes. Adams wrote about it in extraordinary detail the same evening. In a letter to John Jay, who was then serving as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, he described the king as visibly emotional at the start, his voice breaking when he spoke of the circumstances of their meeting, composing himself with effort. George III told Adams that he had been the last person to consent to American independence, but that since the separation had been made and had become inevitable, he had always said, as he said now, that he would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. He said he was glad the appointment had fallen on someone who had so many years been an inhabitant of England, and that he hoped Adams would find he had retained no resentment from the late unfortunate contest. Adams wrote that the king then said something he had not expected. George III told him that in whatever state of life he had been placed, he should have been a good man. He was speaking. Adams understood. About himself. About his own character. About the distinction he wanted to make between the king, whose policies had done what they had done, and the man behind those policies, who believed, still, that he had acted from duty and from conscience. Adams told the king that he could see that he was the most accomplished gentleman he had ever had the honor of meeting. It was a diplomat's answer. It was also, underneath the diplomacy, something true. George III was in person Without the apparatus of imperial policy and royal proclamation between him and the person he was speaking to, a man of genuine warmth and intelligence, and what Adams recognized, whatever he thought of what it had produced, as sincere moral seriousness. The meeting ended. Both men bowed. Adams left. He wrote to Jay that the interview had been the most affecting and most extraordinary he had ever experienced, and that he had found himself moved in ways he had not expected by a king. He had never imagined he would pity. Pity is an interesting word for Adams to have chosen. He was not a sentimental man. He did not use words loosely. He had looked at George III across a room in London and seen something he had not seen in the caricature that the Declaration of Independence had constructed. Something that made a different and more complicated kind of sense of the whole story. He had seen a man who had done what he believed was right and had been wrong, and who was living with that, and who would go on living with it for the rest of his life. The years between Yorktown and the end of George III's effective reign were not years of collapse or despair. They were something stranger. The years of a man continuing to do his work in a world that had changed in ways he could not fully process, carrying the weight of what had happened without being able to set it down. He remained engaged with politics. He fought hard against Catholic emancipation in Ireland, against parliamentary reform, against the changes that reformers were beginning to argue for with increasing confidence. He was, in these later battles, fighting to hold a line that was moving regardless of what he did. He developed a genuine working relationship with William Pitt the Younger, who became Prime Minister in 1783 at the age of 24. Pitt was 46 years younger than the king, and in some ways the political son that George's actual sons had not managed to be. They disagreed on many things, but for most of 2 decades they worked together with the mutual respect of 2 very different people who recognized something essential in each other. Pitt rebuilt British finances after the war. He managed relations with the new American Republic with a pragmatism that the king found easier to accept in practice than in principle. He kept Britain stable during the years when the rest of Europe was being turned upside down by events in France that genuinely terrified George III, in a way that the American Revolution had not quite managed to do. The American Revolution had been, in George III's understanding, a constitutional crisis within the empire. Wrong, misguided, the product of agitators exploiting legitimate grievances to produce an outcome that went far beyond what most colonists had wanted. But it was conducted within a recognizable framework of political argument and military conflict and eventual negotiation. The French Revolution was something else. The execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793 affected George III in a way that his correspondence from the period makes clear. He was a religious man, a constitutional monarchist, a person who believed in the organic relationship between a country and its traditions. The guillotine in Paris was not just a foreign atrocity. It was a proof of concept for the argument that had been made against him in America and that he had refused to accept. The argument that authority derived not from tradition and divine order, but from the consent of the governed, and that consent, once withdrawn, made any king expendable. He had survived the American version of that argument. He watched France being consumed by the more radical version of it and felt, in the watching, something that his letters suggest was a cold recognition. He had said this was where such ideas led. He had said it for 20 years. The irony, which he was probably not positioned to appreciate fully, was that the American Republic, the country whose founding he had done everything in his power to prevent, was serving as the proof that the more radical version was not inevitable. That self-governance did not have to produce the guillotine, that a revolution could create a government that was stable and functional, The Americans were making it work. He had lost. And what he had lost to was working. In the autumn of 1788, the signs that had been easy to explain away stopped being easy to explain away. Something was happening to the king's mind. The first thing people noticed was that he could not stop talking, not in the way that nervous people talk, filling silence because silence makes them uncomfortable. He talked the way a river runs, continuously and without apparent effort, moving from one subject to another without pausing to breathe in the normal way, without waiting for a response, without seeming to notice whether anyone was listening. He talked about the farms at Windsor and the state of the harvest and the price of wool and the disposition of naval forces in the Mediterranean, and a conversation he had with Charlotte 20 years ago, and the proper way to address a letter to a bishop, and the theological implications of a passage in the book of Job. He talked for hours. His attendants did not know what to do. This was the King of England. You did not tell the King of England to please be quiet, that he had been speaking for 3 hours without stopping, that the people in the room needed rest. You stood and you listened and you waited for it to end. The autumn of 1788. George III was 50 years old. He had been on the throne for 28 years. He had survived the loss of America, the strain of the war years, the political battles of the 1780s. He had seemed, to most people who knew him, to be managing, quieter than he had been in his youth. Yes, but managing. Then the talking started. And after the talking came the other things. Charlotte noticed first. She had lived with this man for 27 years. She knew his rhythms, his habits, the specific quality of his attention when he was well, and the specific quality when something was wrong. What she was seeing in the autumn of 1788 was neither of those things. It was something she did not have a name for. She told the royal physicians. The royal physicians came. What followed tells you as much about the state of medicine in the 18th century as it does about the state of the king's mind. The physicians of the era understood very little about what happened when a human mind began to malfunction. What they understood, or believed they understood, was that mental disturbance was related to physical imbalance in the body, to an excess of certain humours that needed to be corrected through interventions that would strike any modern observer as indistinguishable from torture, blistering, in which the skin was deliberately burned to draw out the bad humours believed to be causing the disturbance, purging, in which the patient was given substances to induce vomiting, restriction, in which the patient was physically restrained to prevent the kind of agitated movement that was seen as both a symptom and a worsening factor. George III was the King of England. He was also, in the winter of 1788 and 1789, a patient who had no ability to refuse what was done to him, because the thing that had happened to him had taken away the capacity to make that kind of refusal credible. Francis Willis arrived in December of 1788. Willis was a clergyman who had moved into the care of people with mental disturbances, which in the 18th century meant he ran an establishment in Lincolnshire where people who had lost their minds were housed and managed. He had a reputation for effectiveness, meaning that a certain number of his patients improved while under his care, which was a higher standard than most of his contemporaries could claim. His methods were built on a theory that mental disturbance was, at its core, a failure of will and self-control, and that the appropriate treatment was to reassert external control over the patient until the patient's own control could be restored. He rewarded cooperation and punished resistance. The primary tool was the communication to the patient that his behavior had consequences, and that the consequences for good behavior were better than the consequences for bad behavior. For a king, the application of this theory required the complete inversion of every relationship that had defined his life. Willis told George III what to do. When George III did it, he was rewarded. When he did not, he was restrained. The restraint took physical forms. A chair designed to hold the patient immobile. A garment that prevented the movement of the arms. These were not unusual instruments in the institutional treatment of mental disturbance in the 18th century. They were standard. They were also, when applied to a man who had spent 28 years as the sovereign of the most powerful empire in the world, a kind of humiliation that went beyond the physical. Charlotte was permitted to visit when Willis judged that the king was calm enough to benefit from it without agitation. The visits were supervised. She sat with her husband in a room where the doctor had the authority, and she had the role of a visitor rather than a wife. And she tried to be present for a man who on good days was something like the person she had known for 27 years, and on bad days did not seem to know who she was. She wrote letters during this period that survive. They do not describe the situation in detail. Charlotte was too controlled for that. Too much a product of her training and her position to put the full weight of what she was experiencing into writing. But the letters have a quality in them, a flatness underneath the correct language, the quality of a person who has put some necessary distance between herself and what she is living through in order to continue living through it. The question of what was actually wrong with George III has been argued about by doctors and historians for 2 centuries. And any diagnosis from 2 centuries away must remain provisional. For most of the 20th century, the dominant explanation was porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that can produce severe abdominal pain, weakness in the limbs, and, in some forms, neurological and psychiatric symptoms, including confusion, agitation, and hallucinations. 2 doctors, Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter, proposed this diagnosis in 1969, and it was adopted so widely that it became, for several decades, essentially the official explanation. The porphyria theory has problems. Researchers who examined the evidence more carefully in the years after 2000 found that the fit between porphyria's known symptoms and what George III actually experienced was less clean than McAlpine and Hunter had suggested. Some of his symptoms fit, others did not. More recent scholarship has moved toward explanations involving recurrent mania, or what would now be called bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by episodes of elevated mood, decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, and pressured speech, alternating with periods of normal function. The talking that his attendants described, the hours-long monologues, the apparent inability to stop, the shift in his sleep patterns, the heightened energy followed by collapse. These are consistent with what a manic episode looks like. There is also evidence of arsenic. Analysis of surviving samples of the king's hair, conducted in 2004 at the University of London, found arsenic levels significantly above what would be expected, and arsenic was present in several of the medicines his physicians prescribed. Arsenic, in sufficient quantities, can cause or worsen neurological symptoms, and it is possible that some of what his doctors observed was produced or worsened by the treatments they were administering. The honest answer, which is the only answer the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know with certainty what was wrong with George III. We know that something was wrong, that it came in episodes, that it was severe, and that the treatments available to 18th century medicine almost certainly made it worse. What we know with certainty is that he suffered. He recovered in the spring of 1789, which is the word the records use, and the recovery was genuine enough that the country celebrated. There were services of thanksgiving in churches. People gathered in the streets. Farmer George was back. The familiar, slightly eccentric, fundamentally decent king who grew vegetables and loved his family and could be seen riding through Windsor in the early morning. But something had shifted in ways that people who knew him well noticed. Some quality of ease was gone. He was more easily agitated, more prone to the kind of rigidity that had always been part of his character, but that had previously been balanced by other things. He had two more serious episodes. In 1801 and in 1804, he recovered from both. Partially, each recovery leaving him somewhat less than he had been before, and then, in 1810, his youngest and most beloved daughter, Amelia, died at the age of 27 after a long illness that her father had watched, with the particular helplessness of a parent who has all the power in the world and cannot use any of it to save his child. After Amelia's death, the darkness came back and did not leave. He was 72 years old. He had been king for 50 years. He did not know what year it was. He did not know who Charlotte was. He walked the corridors of Windsor and talked to people who were not there. And somewhere in the diminishing space of his awareness, the world that he had spent his entire life trying to hold together was continuing without him, becoming things he could not have imagined and would never now know. In the rooms above the state apartments at Windsor Castle, a very old man was playing the harpsichord. It was somewhere in the winter of 1819. The exact date did not matter to him. Dates had stopped mattering some years back, along with names and faces and the sequence of events that connects one moment to the next in a way that allows a person to know where they are in the story of their own life. What remained was the music. He played the same pieces he had played 50 years ago, compositions that his hands knew without his mind having to direct them. The muscle memory of a lifetime of sitting at keyboards, surviving intact in the parts of him that the illness had not reached. When the music came, something in his face changed. Not recognition. Exactly. Something deeper than that. Something that lived below the level where the illness could operate. His attendants listened from the corridor. Some of them had been with him for years. They had watched the man they served become, slowly and then completely, someone without the context that makes a person legible to other people. And yet, when the music played, there was something there that they could not explain, except to say that it was him. The music would stop. The old man would sit for a while. Then he would stand and walk to the window and look out at the grounds of Windsor and see. It seemed something that was not there. In February of 1811, his eldest son, George, had become Prince Regent. The arrangement acknowledged what had been obvious for months, that the king could no longer conduct the business of ruling, that the documents requiring his signature could not be reliably brought before him, and the decisions requiring his judgment could not be reliably made by him. Charlotte came when she could. She was in her own declining health by then. The decades of managing a large family and the particular strains that the king's illness had placed on her had left marks. She was 73 when she died. In November of 1817, at Kew, in a chair, holding the hand of her son, the Prince Regent. The king was at Windsor. He was not told that his wife had died. This decision, made by the physicians and the family, was not cruelty. It was the acknowledgement of a specific kind of mercy, available only when a person can no longer process information in the normal way. Charlotte had been George III's wife for 57 years. She had been the person he taught to speak English in the evenings of their early marriage, one word at a time, in the lamplight of their private rooms. She had been the mother of his 15 children. She had been the fixed point of a domestic life that had remained warm and genuine even as the public life surrounding it became catastrophic. He would not have understood that she was gone. He would have experienced only the fact of her absence, which would have registered as loss without context, grief without object, the pain of a wound he could not locate. Better, the people around him decided that he not know. He lived another 2 years and 2 months after Charlotte died. In those years, while he played his music in the rooms above the state apartments and walked the corridors and spoke to people who were not there, the world outside Windsor was doing things that would have been unrecognizable to the man he had been. Napoleon had been defeated at Waterloo in 1815. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn the map of Europe. The United States of America had fought a second war against Britain. The war that began in 1812 and ended in 1815, and had emerged from it with its identity more firmly established than before. No longer a fragile experiment, but a country that had held its own against the most powerful empire in the world. The empire that George III had spent his life defending had not collapsed with the loss of America. It had pivoted. India was becoming the center of gravity of British imperial power. Australia had been established as a colony. The Caribbean remained important. The empire was changing shape, losing some things and gaining others. And it would go on changing for another century and more. George III knew none of this. He was past knowing. On the 29th of January, 1820, George III died at Windsor Castle. He was 81 years old. He had been king for 59 years and 3 months, longer than any British monarch before him. The announcement was made in the formal language of royal deaths, designed to convey significance while communicating as little actual feeling as possible. The newspapers published assessments of his reign that were careful in the way that assessments of someone recently dead are careful, finding the kind words and the measured criticisms and the appropriate historical context. The people who gathered outside Windsor were not numerous. This was not a nation in acute mourning. The king who was being mourned had been, in any functional sense, gone for nearly a decade. The death was a formality, the final paperwork at the end of a life that had effectively concluded years before. He was buried in St. First, George's Chapel, at Windsor, in a vault beneath the floor, with the ceremony that his position required, the same position that had been placed on his shoulders at the age of 22, when he was a young man who wanted above all else to be a British king, to be the thing his mother had told him he had to be, to hold the line against everything that threatened the dignity of the crown and the integrity of the empire. He had held it. He had held it when he should have held it, and when he should not have held it, and he himself could rarely tell the difference, and the difference, in the end, was everything. The harpsichord at Windsor went quiet in January of 1820, the music that had survived when everything else was gone, the notes his hands had remembered when his mind could no longer remember his wife's name, stopped. The rooms above the state apartments went still, and outside, the world that George III had fought to keep, changed, and changed again, and kept going. On a Thursday evening in August of 2015, a theatre in Midtown Manhattan went dark, and then a single spotlight came up on a man in a red velvet coat and a white powdered wig. And the audience that had paid extraordinary amounts of money to be in that room leaned forward together, and the man in the red coat opened his mouth and sang. The song was called "You'll Be Back." It was a break-up song. It was written from the perspective of a king who cannot understand why his colonies have left him and is confident. With the cheerful certainty of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong, that they will return. The lyrics were funny. The performance was funnier. By the end of the number, the audience was on its feet. George III had become a pop star. Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton gave a generation of Americans their most vivid image of the man who had tried to prevent their country from existing. He was a comic figure, a foil, the straight man in a story about people with more energy and more vision and more capacity for transformation. He appeared 3 times, sang 3 songs, and each appearance was structured to produce the same effect. The laughter of an audience that understood they were watching the losing side of history perform its own irrelevance. It was not inaccurate. Exactly. George III did have difficulty accepting that the colonies were gone. He did continue to believe for longer than the evidence warranted that the situation might be recoverable. The emotional logic of the character Miranda created was connected to something real in the historical record, but it was a caricature, built for the specific purpose that caricatures serve, which is to make a complicated person legible in a short amount of time to an audience that needs to understand their role in the story without being distracted by the parts of them that do not fit the role. The question worth asking is what America has needed George III to be across 250 years, and what that need tells us about America itself. Start at the beginning. The Declaration of Independence created a specific version of George III in 1776. For specific reasons that Jefferson understood completely and executed brilliantly. The 27 accusations, the relentless focus on he, the construction of a single face for everything that the new nation was rejecting. This was not dishonesty. It was the necessary work of revolution. The creation of an enemy clear enough and specific enough that people could organize themselves against it. That image needed to be maintained after the revolution. Because nations that have been born through conflict need the memory of the conflict to hold together in the difficult years that follow. George III, as villain, served that purpose. He served it in the schoolbooks of the 19th century, in the paintings that depicted the revolution as a contest between enlightened American patriots and corrupt British power, in the 4th of July speeches where orators catalogued the tyrannies of the crown and the virtues of the founders. The shape worked. America became a country, the story held. The academic historians started complicating the story in the middle of the 20th century. Louis Namier, whose work on 18th century English politics was published in the 1920s and 1930s, demonstrated in meticulous detail that George III had not been the active, dominating tyrant of American myth. Parliament had real power. The ministers had real power. The king operated within a constitutional system that constrained him in ways that the Declaration of Independence had deliberately chosen not to emphasize. This created a problem for a certain kind of popular history. If the king was not actually a tyrant in the way the Declaration said he was, then what exactly had the revolution been about? And did the founding lose some of its moral clarity if the villain was less villainous than advertised? The answer that serious historians arrived at was that the revolution did not need George III to be a monster to be justified. The constitutional argument was real. The principle of self-governance was real. The suffering caused by British policies was real. The revolution could be fully justified without the caricature. But the caricature had done its work so thoroughly, had been embedded so deeply, that it was not easy to replace with something more complicated. The Mad King image filled some of the space that the tyrant image left when historians started complicating it. George III's mental illness became, in the popular understanding of his reign, the explanation for a great deal. He was mad. That was why he lost America. That was why the policies were so rigid and unresponsive. The madness explained the failure in a way that was satisfying, because it located the problem in a person, in a medical condition, in something that could be named. This explanation is wrong in the specific sense that matters most. George III lost America while he was entirely sane. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the coercive acts, the Olive Branch petition rejected without being read, the decision to hire Hessian mercenaries, the escalation after Bunker Hill. Every decision that made American independence first thinkable and then inevitable was made by a man in full possession of his mental faculties. The illness came after. It came as a consequence of a life under extraordinary pressure, as a cruel addition to the losses he had already sustained. But it was not the cause of those losses. Using the madness to explain the political failure is a way of avoiding the more uncomfortable explanation, which is that a sane, conscientious, intelligent, morally serious man made decisions that produced catastrophic outcomes, not because he was broken, but because he was working from a framework of understanding about empire and authority that was, in the specific circumstances of the American colonies, fatally inadequate. That explanation is harder to live with. It does not have the clean resolution of the king was mad, and so he failed. It has instead the messier resolution of a man who was reasoning carefully and still got it catastrophically wrong. And the catastrophe was not incidental to the careful reasoning, but in some ways a product of it. This is an explanation that has implications for things other than George III. And those implications may be why it has been slower to find its way into popular culture than the madness narrative. America's 250th anniversary, which falls in 2026, has produced a wave of reconsideration. Museums are mounting exhibitions that place the revolution in the context of the loyalists who opposed it, the enslaved people who navigated it, the native nations who were destroyed by it, the ordinary people on both sides who wanted nothing more than to live their lives without being conscripted into someone else's great historical argument. George III appears in these reconsiderations as a more complicated figure, a man whose decisions had consequences, who was shaped by forces he did not choose, who operated within a system he did not design, and who was then handed the bill for all of it by a document that needed a face and chose his. Now, go back to that summer, Philadelphia, 1776. Men signing their names to a document that said, "All men are created equal," knowing that many of them owned human beings, knowing that the country they were founding would have to reckon with that contradiction eventually, not knowing how long eventually would take or what it would cost. London, 1776. A man reading dispatches from a war he had started and could not stop, writing in his private correspondence about duty and obligation and the impossibility of yielding, not knowing that he had already lost, not knowing that the losing would define his legacy for as long as his legacy lasted. New York, 1776. A crowd melting a golden statue into bullets. Nova Scotia, 1776. Thomas Peters trying to find land that the British government had promised him. The Ohio Valley, 1776. Joseph Brant watching the western frontier that the proclamation of 1763 had drawn, knowing that the line was going to disappear and not knowing how quickly. Philadelphia, 1776. John Dickinson writing letters that no one wanted to read. Windsor, 1761. Charlotte learning the English words her husband taught her, one at a time, in the lamplight, trying to belong to a country she had not chosen. All of them, in the same years, doing what human beings do in the middle of history, trying to figure out what is happening and what they should do about it, with incomplete information and limited time and forces larger than themselves, bearing down on whatever space they had managed to carve out for their own intentions. None of them knew how it was going to end. That is the thing that retrospective clarity takes away from the people who lived through it. They did not know. They were guessing, choosing, acting on the best information available to them, which was never enough information, and trying to do something that could be justified when the accounting came. George III did not cause all the questions that the summer of 1776 raised. The questions about who gets to be governed and on what terms, about the relationship between stated ideals and lived reality, about what a nation owes, the people it has failed, and the people it has excluded, and the people it has used up and set aside. Those questions existed before him and would have existed without him, but he was the person that America chose, in the summer of 1776, to embody everything. Those questions were in opposition to. He became the face of what the new country was not going to be. And then he lived for another 44 years. He sat in his palaces, and then in the rooms at Windsor, where the world he had known became increasingly difficult to access. And he carried, somewhere in the diminishing space of his awareness, the weight of all of it, the empire and the war, and the people who had chosen him, and the people who had rejected him, and the wife he had taught to speak, and the children he had raised, and the music that his hands still knew when his mind had forgotten everything else. He was more than the decision that lost America. He was also more than the illness that took his mind. He was a person who was born into circumstances he did not choose, shaped by people who had their own limitations, given a responsibility so large that most people cannot fully imagine carrying it, and who carried it, in his own way. For 59 years, history needed him to be a villain, so it made him one. The making was not dishonest. Exactly. The things he did were real. The harm that resulted was real. The America that exists today exists partly because of what he did, and partly in deliberate opposition to what he did. But the villain and the man are not the same thing. Ở đâu đó giữa bức tượng vàng bị kéo xuống, người đàn ông già chơi harpsichord trong bóng tối Windsor, và nhân vật hài trên sân khấu Broadway là con người thật, between the gilded lead statue pulled down at Bowling Green and the old man playing his harpsichord in the dark at Windsor, and the comic figure singing on a Broadway stage. There is a real man, a man who tried, in his own way, with the tools he had been given, which were not enough, to do what his mother had told him he had to do. Be a king. He was one, until the very end. Whether that was a triumph or a tragedy depends on what you think kingship is for, and that question, like most of the questions that the summer of 1776 raised, is still being answered by all of us, right now,